Now, also, another complicated part of the story is this. In Cincinnati, Ohio, keep in mind the conservative Midwestern city, we take influences from each coast, okay? We see what's going on in New York, we see what's going on in Los Angeles, and we try to combine it in Cincinnati, okay? Enter a guy named Stephen Powers. He's a writer based in New York City. Stephen Powers was either stupid enough or bold enough to go outside in the daytime and write graffiti and paint his graffiti on these store gates in New York City. Here's an example. ESPO. What he would do is this. He would paint these gates yellow first. So it looked like he was painting over graffiti, right? And then he would go in with black and just write his name out there. And no one questioned him. All right? No one questioned him. We heard about this through graffiti magazines. Now this is around 98, 99, okay? The internet was in its baby steps. We didn't communicate that way. It was through magazines and people talking about it. So we heard word through the grapevine as we call it, through the grapevine that this guy was going out in the daytime, Stephen Powers, and doing stuff like this, as bold as this, in New York City. So I figured, wait a minute, if this guy can go out there in the daytime and do his graffiti and get away with it, what would happen if you put on a vest? A yellow vest. What would happen then? And then go out in the daytime, right? And further than that, what happens when you put on a vest, go out in the daytime, and you have a nice hard hat on with an American flag? Now you have a working costume. You have a disguise. This is my thought process at the time. And I not only thought about it, but I put it into action. So here I am with a vest and a hard hat on, applying graffiti, at the same time. So now, keep in mind, my traditional route, remember I said I'm interested in the traditional route of graffiti, right? That was what I was into. As you can see, you're going to see it goes in a different course throughout these influences, through Andre and a guy named, Steve Powers. And now, so this began to change our approach to graffiti. Why is that? Because this is Andre, my friend Andre, doing it as well. Not only were we concerned with just writing stuff on the wall, but now we're playing with what construction workers play with, what they manipulate, what they handle every single day. Street signs. So we would take a street sign, like this, something common like this. What we would do is this. We would go around the street. Sometimes cars hit signs. I don't know if you guys have ever seen like a street sign that's been hit by a car. In the United States and in America, sometimes it's just left there, just to rot for whatever reason. They just let them sit there. So what we do is collect these street signs, right? Take them back home, paint them up, and put them right back up with the vest on and the hard hat. No one said a word. Middle of the daytime, people would actually ask directions. They would come up to us and say, hey, how do you get to this street and that street? While we were doing something completely illegal. They thought that we were actually working for the city. We weren't, of course. We were artists. Now here's a version of Andre's. So this is mine, this is Andre's. So you can see we're alternating styles. Or we would go so far as to take something like this, a news box, right? You have newspapers, has graffiti all over it. What we would do is go out in the daytime with our vest, our hard hat, and yank that from where it was, paint it in the studio, paint it at home, and then put it right back out on the sidewalk with a chain around it, okay? Just so no one could take it. And then go so far as to put our own newspapers in them. This is the extent to which this vest really expanded our vocabulary, right? No longer am I just writing my name, I'm doing that in addition to doing this also. So that's what this vest and this hard hat has done, has changed my work as a graffiti writer. Now here's another example of that here, where I just cut out the names of my graffiti writing friends and just put it around the news box there. Now, also, we had heard word at this time, I'm still in Cincinnati, by the way, of a guy named Cause, who was in the East Coast in New York, and a guy named Barry McGee, who was in San Francisco in California. We had heard through the same graffiti grapevine, right, the graffiti magazines, that these two artists were going to subway bus stops, removing the poster, and then putting it right back up in the post, in the slot. And we heard this and say, wait a minute, we can do this now. So let's try it. So let's do that. Let's take out the poster, you know, forget what was on it, what it was selling cheeseburgers, who cares? It looks better with our artwork on it. That was our philosophy. So we would take 2 little screws. If you were here, you could get up underneath there and see that this is just 2 screws, unscrew it, and then the door opens and then the poster just comes right out. You paint it at home, you know, and then put it right back up and then re-screw it. And then put kind of glue in it so that it's difficult to get out. This is what we were doing. This is what we were doing, yes. And that's one of Andre's there. So you can see that you can just see how now this is not the traditional route of the graffiti writer, even though I considered myself a graffiti writer at the time. Here's another example in a bus stop. And there's one of Andre's there. So these are different elements that we're doing with this disguise. Now we also looked at the phone booth. Now these phone booths are now becoming less and less popular because everyone has a cell phone. Now, but keep in mind in 1998, 1999, they were still all around. So we would take the signs and I would just put my name in there and put it right back on. And I remember when we did this specific sign, we were putting it up with our vest and our hard hat. And there was about 30 other people with hard hats and vests right next to us, working on the street. And they never questioned us. Never questioned us, not once. That shows you how effective that disguise was. Now, so here I am. If you can see, I'm still using verbs. That's my tag name. But what's changing is the location and what kind of objects I'm using to manipulate. That's the only thing that's changing. And that will change sooner or later. I'll get to that. Now, also, you know, I even went so far as to go into the grocery store and change that up a little bit so that if you were shopping and you happened to see a verbs item, you know, you would know that that was my tag. That's me, by the way, shopping. Now, around 1999, 98, I left the small, conservative, Midwestern town of Cincinnati and landed in big, obnoxious, loud Brooklyn, New York City. Have you guys ever been there before, Brooklyn, New York? It's much different than Cincinnati in a lot of ways. I went to a place called Pratt Institute, which is an art school. You know, it's a very nice art school. And while I was there in New York, I continued my agenda of writing verbs. That was still ingrained in my mind. I was still a traditional graffiti writer in that respect. That was the only thing I wrote was that. But I would go as big and as loud as possible. As you can see the scale, I mean, this is about, a human would be about that big. And that was done illegal. And obviously you can see the Empire State Building, and that's the Williamsburg Bridge. So I was still on this agenda of writing verbs as big and loud and bold as possible. You can see this from the Manhattan Bridge, from the subway train. And that's in the Lower East Side, which is actually still there. And surprisingly, because graffiti in New York doesn't last very long, so in some places. So I was still on this agenda of putting verbs wherever I could, but doing it differently also. Still being alternative in a way, and still trying to represent Cincinnati to the utmost fullest. This hat here is a Cincinnati Reds hat. That's our local baseball team. And this is on the A train in Manhattan. It's a train that goes through Brooklyn and Manhattan. It's a very major train line. So I was continuing to write verbs and do verbs in as many different places as possible. You see, and here's kind of a slight version of verbs. You see, where all I did was I used the same format, but I changed a word. You know, instead of phone, it says verbs. You see, and that's a very, very useful device in some cases. And I also took advantage of the signs there. In New York City, I had never really gone on any subway in Cincinnati. But in New York, they were everywhere. Everyone uses the trains. So obviously, they have a lot of signs there as well. So I figured, wait a minute, I'm a specialist in signs. What happens when I take one down? You know, take it to my house, studio, repaint it, and put it right back up again. And then go so far as to say, yes, I did do this. Like, you know, as you know, kind of foolish as it is, I did that. That was my mentality at the time. You know, showing verbs in such a big variety, you know, as possible.